A very warm welcome, everyone. Hello, dear Xiaowen. We are here to celebrate the digital book launch of your artist book, Oriental Silk. Hello, dear Michael, and hello, dear Nicky. We are the participants. My name is Inka Gressel. I'm co-directing here at the IFA Gallery in Berlin, and we are happy to present the book in the digital sphere. So may I suggest to you, dear public, dear listeners, to maybe just take your preferred book you have at hand, which is a hardcover and has a linen, and then you can feel it, since we will talk a lot about feel and tactile notions. We have the book here. For those of you, choose the one you have at hand and you like. I really am happy, dear Xiaowen, that we can show this book launch together. And maybe just to give you all a brief introduction, dear audience, we have here Xiaowen, who is artist and writer, and she's based in Berlin. And her work as an artist and writer is concerned a lot with how people and things move through time and through space, with a particular interest, I would say, in personal witness and testimony. And the book we'll talk about shows this very profound. Nicky Harman, she's a full-time translator from Chinese literature to English. So I appreciate this work a lot. It's really all my gratitude for being able to do this. And Michael, he's a designer and director based in London. Actually, Nicky as well is based in London, so I'm glad that we can meet in that way. And Michael has a focus on visual identity and really also a content-driven work he's realizing as a designer with big brands like, I'm really impressed, Apple, Google, Facebook, and important that it's concept-driven pieces that you work in your visual communication. So we are the ones. My name is Inka. I'm co-directing here the IFA Gallery. And actually Xiaowen also is the assistant director of the Time Art Center in Berlin, and we are in a good neighborhood with our institutions. But let's use this digital sphere here to talk about a book that had been released in 2020 by Hatje Cantz, and Hatje Cantz is co-hosting this event as well. So hello and thank you, dear Vincenz, for being with us tonight. Oh, yeah, it's in Berlin. We are in Berlin here. It's still a sunny evening. And what else? We have a special for you, which we'll show you in the end, since out of this book also came an artistic collaboration, and we will show you a performance piece by dancer and art dance historian Natalie Meek as a response to this book. And actually we talk about a book, but I would say it's a multimedia project that Xiaowen started to realize when she was in Los Angeles for an artist residency. And I'm impressed how Oriental Silk is really, I would say, a portrait and also an oral history of Kenneth Wong, owner of the shop Oriental Silk in LA, who ran the shop, imported Chinese silk until 2020 it was, when he ran out of business, and maybe what all we hope that he's joining and maybe in Los Angeles participating in this event as well. And the project that Xiaowen started shows how through a personal narration, because Ken really is very intimately and very detailed talking about his family's migration story of 4 generations. And it can be seen really also as a macro frame for Asian American migration in America. And it shows about the rise and the fall of that shop in Beverly Hills, and related to this, the Hollywood film industry and that also of international trade of silk and thread, since his parents in the 70s, when they founded the shop, they were able to import silk from China when China still was during the Cultural Revolution. So we see how the personal becomes a collective history. And the shop show, when you told me you went there times and times, became a very productive place for you to reflect on the people and the stories that are behind and how closely they are interwoven. And I think, before I'm talking too long, to contextualize the whole project and to show you how rich the film and now the book that had been launched is, the colors and the talking of Ken and the translation of a personal narrative. We'll have a look into the trailer of the film to introduce you to that world and the translation processes. So Xiaowen, the floor is yours.
Okay, we can. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I guess as the technician is preparing, show us a 2-minute film trailer. I just want to say that I'm really thankful to be here. And thank you, Inka, for the wonderful introduction. I'm super thrilled to be joined by Nicky and Michael to talk about Oriental Silk. As Inka said, this project is about touch and tactility, craft and value, and the colors of memory. Through the worldview of the shop owner, Kenneth Wong, the beauty of silk and its wondrous craftsmanship stand for the human pursuits that link people and places and provide purpose across time and borders. So I can't wait to talk more about the book with you. Let's just dive into the 2-minute film trailer, then we will come back.
People used to come here in the 70s and 80s. Red Button's wife used to be a regular customer. One time he came with his wife. He didn't want to wait his turn. He said to my dad, "Do you know who I am?" He said, "I'm Red Buttons." And my dad said, "Well, I'm glad to meet you. I'm Mr. Wong."
Oh, is that beautiful? Mm-hmm. This is really, really incredible.
Yeah, now all you find is machine embroidery.
And just mass produced.
Yeah, yep. I had a customer. She bought 100 children and made pajamas for Lourdes, for Madonna's daughter. I was told that they were Lourdes' favorite pajamas. This business is very people-oriented, and so that's very rewarding. You can't find these anymore. Nobody makes these. And you look at the detail. This is all hand-painted. The workmanship is just so fine. I don't think people understand. People need to know where they came from. I watched them start this business from nothing. I never understood my mom's feelings for my father until after he passed. So it's hard to let go.
People need to know where they come from. This is touching. And dear audience, we cannot see you, but as you see, there is a question and answer chat. Please feel free anytime to ask questions. We start a conversation, talk about the book, show you more details to get a feeling. Feel free to pose your questions in the chat. And maybe it would be nice to also show where you come from. Then we see how we are connected, because also the whole project is about that idea, untied to tie, to connecting and newly connecting to create a new flexible whole. Thank you. And Xiaowen, the film that we just saw was launched in 2015, and now you released the book. What was your motive for doing the book after the film?
Yeah, absolutely. So I prepped a little presentation, just including some images to help contextualize the project and the whole idea and process behind the book. Can you all see my shared screen? To answer Inka's question, I think it's worth mentioning that Oriental Silk began as a documentary project comprising a single channel film and a dual channel film installation. Then over the past years, the project has evolved and become multifaceted, including also textile installations, textile works and installations. In 2019, I remember in June, actually, I had a conversation with Harman, who ended up becoming my editor. He was the one who suggested me to publish the book with Hatje Cantz. I think I saw him in the participants just now. Hello, Aaron. And I'm very grateful for his suggestion, actually. So for me, I think I wanted to explore another way to archive the project Oriental Silk for Kenneth Wong and for myself. In a sense, what could be more compelling and archival than a book, right? I was also very interested in exploring how one story could be told in multiple ways by employing different strategies. In writing the book, I allowed myself to be more personal, letting the reader into my connection with the Oriental Silk project. Here's a quote from my book. I feel films are more fluid, but the written word is more profound. I wanted the book to reflect my own personal narration and engagement with Mr. Wong's narrative. If in the film I was stepping back to disappear and document behind the camera, then in the book I stepped forward. The reader I had in mind for the book was someone who had an understanding of both Western and Chinese cultures, or who wanted to gain a wider perspective on them. So there were all these different layers, such as diaspora, identity, the fabrication of cultural traditions, and the more intimate levels of family history that I had been processing since the beginning of the project, that were already in the film, but not necessarily apparent to every audience. And I try to interweave this more concretely in the book. I also wanted to mention that the book was informed by the exchanges I had with the public after showing the film in different places. I would get all sorts of questions during screenings or Q&A. Some people wanted to know more about the film's protagonist, Mr. Wong, while others, they were interested in understanding how to connect his story to historical narratives. The questions I encountered over the past years really helped me shape the book's structure. Another crucial point is that in the documentary film, I didn't actively question the origin and context of Oriental Silk, or of Oriental or Orientalism, because the story was narrated through Kenneth Wong's oral history. I sort of let the audience decide how to interpret and question that aspect. Then in the book, however, a transcript of a conversation recorded at the Rhode Island School of Design, examining this notion with a critical view. Similarly, topics such as diaspora, labor, migration, racial discrimination, and financial meltdown are called out explicitly in the publication. And they were also conceptually intertwined with various design decisions. So these are some of the threads of thoughts that led to the making of the bilingual book. Here I'm just including some information about where to acquire the book. Obviously try to support our local bookshops. I learned from a friend of mine that with most bookshops, you can just go there and place the order, even if they don't have it in stock. Just tell them you want this book, then they can place the order on your behalf from the publisher, Hatje Cantz, directly. So this is one of the things I've found out, that's really the best way to support our local bookshops. So yeah, this is the answer to Inka's question.
Cool. While we wait for Xiaowen to be back with us again, we see Oriental Silk is much about translation. You see, it's a bilingual book, Chinese, English, and there is a lot of processes of translation that happen. We have Xiaowen, as you introduced it, you translated the rhythm, the tone, the story of Kenneth Wong into a storyboard and into a very multi-layered piece. Then Nicky entered the game, translating the story from Chinese to English. And on the next layer, let's say, Michael, you conceptually translated it into design. And each of your languages has a different style. And I think the really best way to get into the literary translation first is to listen to story narration. So thank you, Nicky and Xiaowen, to make us hear the Chinese English bilingual version. Thank you.
Thank you, Inka. So Nicky and I have not rehearsed this. It will be interesting. So our idea is that we would read an excerpt from the first chapter. And the idea is that I would read a paragraph in Chinese, and then Nicky will read the same paragraph in English. 生活在洛杉矶，时间常常在不知不觉的行驶中溜走。步行的时候，我们的视线和移动速度同步，身旁的一草一木都在悠闲地和视线打招呼。跑步的时候，视线跳跃，在动态中随机选择着眼点；而开车的时候，视线在下意识中具有更强的选择性。抵达目的地之后，我们通常可以记得行程中的路标、特殊的建筑及街景。至于这些地点之间有什么，常常只有一个大致的印象。
When I lived in Los Angeles, I used to go for long meandering drives. When we walk, our vision keeps pace with our steps, and every blade of grass and every tree greets us as we pass. When we run, our gaze bounces up and down, and our eyes alight randomly on objects. But when we drive, our eyes have more choice in what they see. Road signs, unusual buildings, and street scenes, although we usually only retain the vaguest impression of everything in between.
一天，我开车经过比弗里大道，这里精品店林立，名车云集。逛街的型男靓女们仿佛都有着相同的小麦色皮肤的基因，在阳光下显得光彩熠熠、柔滑紧致。身上轻柔的 T 恤在微风浮动下恰到好处地勾勒出 他们每周至少3次慢跑，4次普拉提，练就的曼妙身姿。一口钻石般的皓齿，令被墨镜遮挡的半张笑靥依旧春光明媚。洛城人喜爱浅色着装，比弗利山庄的潮人们更是偏爱纯白配裸粉，亚麻配浅金，这种清爽的配色也就成了妇人色。每次经过这些街道，我都会以为自己误入了时尚大片的摄影棚。事实上，这些型男靓女的日常生活和精心打造的拍摄场景也并无差别。
One day, I was driving on Beverly Hills Boulevard. Here, the beautiful people who stroll past ranks of luxury shops and smart cars all seem to have the same golden skin, radiant, smooth and firm. Their soft t-shirts, ruffled by the breeze, perfectly outline flawless bodies that jog at least 3 times a week and practice Pilates 4 times a week, while below wraparound sunglasses, their sunny smiles expose brilliant white teeth. Xiaowen, I think I need to go on. I seem to have 2 paragraphs.
Yes, that was the editing. Yes, please go on.
Los Angeles folk like to wear pastel tones, but in Beverly Hills, they take it 1 stage further. Flesh pink and pure white, linen and pale gold. This is the cool, relaxed look of the truly wealthy. It's a color scheme that suggests to me a perfectly proportioned blonde woman standing naked in the center of an art gallery, her delicate shoulders illuminated by a shaft of golden sunlight that pours in through the glass roof. Every time I come down these streets, I get the impression that I've accidentally wandered onto the set of a blockbuster movie. In fact, there's little difference between the daily lives of these beautiful people and a meticulously choreographed film shoot.
就在视线东扫西晃时，一块巨大而陈旧的店招忽然映入我的眼帘。招牌上以全世界中式快餐店通用的菜刀状字体齐齐排开 Oriental Silk 东方丝绸。这是什么？中国真丝？为什么会开在这条精品街上？这招牌看上去年代久远，或许已经倒闭。这一连串问题逐一蹦出的时候，我早已开过3条街，但按捺不住内心的好奇，又拐了回来，把车停在与丝绸店毗邻的咖啡馆一旁。经过坐在沿街遮阳伞下，一边吸着$10的果昔，一边闲聊的男女们，来到了东方丝绸的门口。
As I was driving through these filmic streets, I was startled to see an enormous, somewhat tatty shop sign, across which marched the following message, written in the kind of choppy typeface recognizable from Chinese restaurants all over the world. Oriental Silk importers. What was this? A Chinese silk shop? What was it doing here, on this street of upscale boutique shops? It looked like something from a bygone age, long gone out of business. By the time these questions had run through my mind, I had driven down 3 more streets. But overcome by curiosity, I turned around and parked my car outside a cafe next to the shop. I got out, walked past the men and women sitting there, sipping their $10 a glass smoothies under parasols, and arrived at the door of Oriental Silk importers.
乍一看，虽然玻璃上贴着营业中的招牌，但这手写的字体显然已经褪了不止1层颜色。玻璃门旁有一排宽敞的橱窗，却被晒成蜜黄的白色百叶窗遮得严严实实，看不出内中究竟。迟疑之际，我还是伸手推了推玻璃门，竟然一下就推开了。迎面而来的不是里3层外3层的琳琅货品， 而是一股陈年老店所特有的醇厚气味。这股气味既不芳香，也不醉人。如果放在旧货店，就是铁锈斑驳、灰尘满布的老中医的医疗香；如果放在二手书店，就是书虫嚼烂、书线疏脱的黄纸片。而这片低调的、仿佛不愿见人的丝绸店，则是老太太搁在阁楼深处，藏满了锦缎珠翠的陪嫁樟木香。
My eye was caught by the open sign, but the handwriting had faded by several shades, and the shutters, once white, now yellowed from exposure to sunlight, were tightly closed over the wide display windows, ensuring that nothing inside was visible. I hesitated, then pushed the glazed door. To my surprise, it opened. Inside, the first thing that assailed my senses was not the glittering display of goods, but a mellow odor that only old shops have. It's not a perfume, as there is nothing intoxicating about it. Rather, it's the smell of dust-covered, rusted Chinese medicine cabinets in an antiques shop. It's the smell of dog-eared, worm-eaten pages of yellow paper, their string binding coming loose in a second-hand bookstore. But in this unassuming silk shop, it was like the smell of an old woman's camphor wood trousseau chest, stored in the attic and filled with bridal brocades and jewelry that only rarely see the light of day.
这样厚重的潮湿气味，简直不是在终年干燥少雨的洛杉矶可以闻到的。一时竟将我的记忆拉回到90年代的上海。那时，我跟着母亲去南京西路的真丝大王国营老店里挑选面料，随后找裁缝师傅量身做衣服。当师傅皱纹苍苍的双手捏着软皮卷尺，在母亲身上精准移动时，我就坐在靠背椅上晃动双脚，眼睛不由自主地瞥向缤纷多彩的细绸软缎，心里暗暗选着哪个好看，哪个更好看。那时我还不懂什么叫抽象画，什么是图案设计，纯粹凭借内心对色彩、构图、明暗、比例的直觉，想象着怎样的花纹适合做连衣裙，怎样的花纹就只能做窗帘或桌布。
It's an odor heavy with humidity, and I had never smelt it in drought-ridden Los Angeles. I was immediately transported back to the 1990s in Shanghai, when my mother used to take me to the state-run Silk Emporium on West Nanjing Road to pick out fabrics. There, the master tailor measured her for the garments he would make for her, holding the tape between pale, wrinkled hands and passing it over her body, while I sat in a high-backed chair, swinging my legs and gazing around at the gloriously colored array of silks and satins. I tried to make up my mind which were the prettiest. I was too young to understand concepts like abstract patterns and designs. I simply allowed my heart to dictate by looking at the color and the pattern of the fabrics, as I imagined which designs would make nice clothes and which were only good for table linen and drapes.
一位60开外的华人老先生应声而出。老先生中等身材，戴着金边方眼镜，头顶半卸，发丝不苟，眼角和嘴角都微微下垂，有着伏案多年、思考多于言谈的人所特有的沉稳。他从暗处走来，身上洗得失去弹性的短袖 polo 衫，在阳光下才显出一点本色。
Inside the Oriental Silk importers, a Chinese man in his 60s came to greet me. He was of medium build and balding, wore gold-rimmed square glasses, and the corners of his eyes and lips were slightly turned down. My first impression was of someone who'd been in the business many years, an unflustered character who weighed his words carefully. He emerged from a gloomy corner, and I saw that he was wearing a short-sleeved polo shirt, so faded that its original color would only show up in sunlight.
您好，请问有什么需要的吗？老先生一口纯正的加州美语，语音低沉柔和。
Can I help you? He greeted me in a low, soft voice. The accent was pure California.
谢谢，我随便看看。我一眼便觉得他是土生土长的美国华人，而非成年以后移民过来，因为他和中国城里为生活奔波的、眼神疲惫的第一代老公移民截然不同。
Thank you, but I'm just browsing, I replied. I sized him up as a homegrown American of Chinese descent, rather than someone who'd come to the US as an adult. He had none of the drivenness and exhausted expression of a first-generation immigrant.
好的，请随意。说着，他便退向柜台后去做自己的事了。
Fine, please take your time. And he retired behind the counter to get on with his work.
走进店铺，才发现它比想象中大很多。老先生的柜台靠近大门，后面整齐地摆放着上中下3层各色织锦缎，争奇斗艳。这组柜台对面还有2组围成一圈的大玻璃柜台，每个圈内都可从容地站下3、4位营业员。此外，店铺4墙从上到下全是货柜，货柜之间凡有空地，不是成排的纽扣架、服饰配件架，就是挂着样衣的衣架，甚至天花板上也都吊满了手绘丝绸制成的各色动物风筝。
It was only when I was in the shop that I realized it was much bigger than I originally thought. The counter was by the door, and behind it lay neatly displayed bolts of silk of every possible hue, embroidered in gorgeous colors. Opposite the counter were more glass counters joined together to form a square big enough to hold 3 or 4 salespeople. The walls were packed from top to bottom with goods, while any available spare space held buttons and other dress accessories of various kinds. Clothes racks with samples hung from them, and even silk kites hanging from the ceiling, decorated with paintings of the 12 animals of the zodiac.
我一时只觉得眼花缭乱，不知从何看起，于是便问老先生：“请问您这家店是何时开张的？感觉很有历史啊。”
I stood there dazzled. I did not know where to start looking, so I asked, "When did you open this shop? It feels really historic."
老先生放下手中的簿册，绕过柜台向我走近，慢条斯理地说道：“这家店是我父母在上世纪70年代初开的，今年我们就要进入第42个年头了。”
He put down the account's book he'd been holding and came out from behind the counter. My parents opened it in the 1970s. This year will have been going for 42 years.
Thank you, Nicky.
Thank you.
It's really to also feel how translation is a process of understanding something. In the case as non-Chinese speaker, we cannot understand. Nicky, and we got an impression how dense and atmospheric this descriptions, the entrance, the first encounter was, and you translated really a very personal, atmospheric, and emotionally, and the experiences of both Ken and also Xiaowen. did you stay, let's say, true to the word, or did you make use of that degree of artistic freedom to really recreate that mood or the tone that we just experienced?
I take my cue from the original. It wouldn't be ethical for me to start changing things around. And I certainly wouldn't want to do that. I mean, it was a most fascinating experience to have this book to translate. I always feel that some of these really fascinating works that I've been given to translate, they give me the opportunity to open a window. I was going to say on Chinese culture, but actually open a window on the history of a family, which takes place in two very different countries in this case. I normally do fiction. I normally translate fiction, and it was a special privilege to have this non-fiction book to do, because I think that it gives so much to the reader, and it gave such a lot to me when I was translating it.
And how was your impression then, Xiaowen, since when translation is something of being in transit or a mediation space, let's say, where also all those nuances that Nicky also mentioned now are considered. Do you have to feel that your text took on a second life, or it was an enriching of the first, or going further?
So yeah, I've been thinking a lot about translation lately, and at the moment, I'd like to consider translation almost as a diasporic experience in itself. You know, I think of Ken as a Chinese American born and raised in California, who actually doesn't speak Chinese. I currently live as an overseas Chinese. I have lived in Shanghai, upstate New York, LA, London, now Berlin. Nicky is British, but obviously, you know, she has a profound knowledge of Chinese as a language, but as well as Chinese culture. So we're dealing with kind of multi-layers of people's personal cultural experiences, as well as larger palettes of movements. And in the first chapter that I just read with Nicky, I described how I stumbled upon Oriental Silk while driving around in LA. I was a new driver then because, you know, learning driving was something I had to force myself to do in LA. So there was definitely this feeling of feeling at odds with the city myself. I think that's why Oriental Silk reminded me of where I came from instantly. It drew my memory back to the 1990s when I grew up in Shanghai. So I think ultimately it was this mix of feelings, being far away from home, feeling in a way alienated, not being able to fully express myself culturally, that prompted my instant connection with Oriental Silk. So I very much see translation as a process of reflecting this mix of feelings. Just like you said, Inka, a mediation space where nuances can be considered. Our past and future, our past and present find like new meanings in this space, not without boundary, but we learn to negotiate and make sense of our beings in between two words, whether it's Chinese American, Chinese European, you know, or anywhere. So yeah, so I think making this book, also working with Nicky closely, really helped me contextualize how writing and translation can provide purposes and enrichments, especially during difficult time, because I constantly think that, you know, we worked on this together with the distance apart in two different countries, which were both going through lockdowns and etc. We also shouldn't forget that the story of Oriental Silk, like most other immigration and international trading stories, are not only experienced through languages, but also touched and felt. So I've also been thinking how this past year of pandemic has reminded all of us how important touching something or someone is and how much we've missed it. So I very much hope to highlight the tactility with the design and the making of the book, which is so wonderfully executed by Hatje Cantz, but first designed by Mike. So I feel like I'm really extremely fortunate to be able to work with Nicky on the language and then also work with Michael on the visual language.
And I think this is a key conceptual element we will have to talk about. But still, I'm curious, Nicky, since from translating from Chinese to English, how much of cultural translation is there, or what is happening in the translation, which is not just literal translation, but also one of thinking, or how much did this interfere in translating documental or fictional texts?
I mean, lots of translators, I'm one of them, we use this lovely phrase, finding a voice is the main challenge when you're translating. But there was an extra tweak, if you like, to finding a voice here, because I do not write pure Californian and I don't speak pure Californian. So I was in the position of finding a voice when Ken Wong had already spoken that voice. I don't do American English. I only do British English. But in a way, that's just quite an interesting thing to think about, because I've translated for lots of American publishers, and that's something you work with. I think at a much deeper emotional level, finding a voice means that the original text, I try to let it speak through me. So I'm trying to achieve the same effect in English. So I'm much less focused on every single character by character. My first draft will be to get all the content from the Chinese into the English, and then I'll begin to revise. And with each revision, I'm working on getting the same effect in the English that the writer got in the Chinese. I mean, it's actually this was such an interesting book to do, because there was also quite a lot of history. And one of the magical things about the book is that it's an apparently unassuming man from a family, a quite ordinary family, and yet their histories, and the history, the way he tells the history is extraordinary. You have history coming through their voices. One of the things that struck me was when Ken talks about his mother's experiences during the Second World War in China, when she had to fight to survive. And one of the things she did was to sell salt, and the only way she could get the salt to the market, I think there were quite strict controls on carrying the salt out, was to take her jacket and soak it in a saline solution, soak it in salt, and then walk with this salt-sodden jacket through the lines, and then sell the salt and get some money with which she could feed her children. And these are extraordinary stories, and that's one of the reasons why I felt so privileged to be able to tell that story.
That giving a voice, for the very first time, Xiaowen, I heard you speaking Chinese, we speak in English normally, and it's also astonishing how much the voice changes, and through changing of the voice in your speaking, it seems you have another layer of an identity. It's also in the body language, when changing the language, something very interesting seems to happen. I just experienced when listening to you. It was interesting. And just a brief note for the audience. Maybe some of you joined in later. Please feel free to also join in your questions in our question chat you see below, so you also can join in. Thank you. And as you already said, Xiaowen, right? And I really want to give the word to Michael now, who is much into it, because as you said, the look and the feel of the book is very tactile. We all have the same experience, and it feels as if there was a reason for everything you did. Or Xiaowen also told me that you spent a day with Kenneth in his shop in Los Angeles. So can you tell us where all those references in the book come from? I mean, we have here the, how can I make you show the color narrative? And then there are those broken lines that remind me of sewing patterns and all the material you used.
For sure, yeah, totally. I've actually prepared a few visual references, so I'm just gonna do screen share. Great, can everyone see this? Fantastic. Yeah, so as you just mentioned, I had an opportunity to spend an afternoon in the shop and speak to Ken. And what was really fantastic about that was the opportunity to be able to kind of rummage through the shop myself and kind of collect visual artifacts and try to establish kind of what are like the key visual signifiers that we can draw reference from that kind of like make the visual language of the shop unique, that we could kind of reinvent in the context of the publication. So one of the first ones that I want to chat about was these really lovely import-export labels that bind each of the rolls of silk. And every single time that they get like a new roll of silk in the shop, they have these lovely little, you know, quite floral, quite like graphic little labels that bind them. And their vernacular is like very, very specific. It's a little bit all over the place. You know, a lot of them are kind of like mixes of like European/Chinese culture or like crossovers in America and all that sort of stuff. But to be able to unroll the sheet of silk, you need to tear that label. And then once you tear it, you're not going to put it back on. You just kind of toss it aside. And I thought that there was something quite unique about both the graphic language and that sort of experience and that interaction of kind of like breaking the seal to each roll. So the idea was, okay, so how can we take that and translate that to the context of reading the publication, which is what led to the decision of having that belly band around the exterior and having like repeated type on it to pick up on the graphics. And the idea is, you know, I guess that technically if you were like very delicate with it, you could slide it right off the top, but I'd encourage anyone who purchases the book to just kind of give it a go. And the first time that you get it, just like tear it open, and then you could either keep it as like a keepsake or just kind of set it aside. But that whole kind of transition of it being a seal and opening up something special and then being able to enjoy that something special for a longer period of time was like a nice idea that we wanted to translate. These are a couple of references of packages of sewing patterns that we found within the shop. I just wanted to include the covers because I thought that they're quite cool. They're all like from the 60s and 70s and definitely like of a totally different time. And when you open them up, as you mentioned, Inka, like you see a lot of these like dotted lines and different types of dotted lines and different types of just like little signs and symbols. You could see these little black diamonds that are used throughout the graphic language and like outline text here and there and a lot of kind of really functional graphics. And you know, like when you're talking to someone about you know, Oriental Silks or just talking about like a fabric shop in general, and you show them dotted lines, they're immediately going to make the connection. So I thought that, you know, making that sort of association through a graphic language could be like a really accessible metaphor. But I thought that there was something also quite nice about, you know, the sewing patterns being the underlying grid of, you know, silk garments. And if we could use that dotted line to expose the underlying grid of the publication, then there's like a really nice parallel to play with. So you could see some examples of what that dotted line grid looks like throughout a few different pages. We play around with the structure quite a bit, but still always built on like the same kind of sandbox. And then in the context of the cover, you see, the grid on the cover is inherently different because the content's different, and you want it to be a little bit more graphic and a little bit more impactful. So the layout is different, but the approach and the sentiment stays the same. And then the last reference that I wanted to bring was color narrative, as you mentioned. So this is a photograph that Xiaowen that she sent my way. And this is like the front of the shop if you're standing directly in front of it at eye level. And when I visited the shop, like the first thing that struck me is, unless you're standing at the other side of the street and you could see the whole building, if you're standing directly in front of the shop, you can actually see what's inside. Like it's obscured by blinds, it's quite pared back, it's quite like minimal. You're not totally sure, is it open, is it not open? It's like very discreet. And then as soon as you step inside, you're hit with this like barrage of color. There are like all these trinkets and different types of objects. And it's just really kind of like inviting you to rummage through things. And we thought that there is quite like an interesting kind of contrast between, that really nuanced, subdued exterior, and then you step in and then you're hit with all of these different colors. So we kept the cover quite neutral, and then each of the different sections within the book were treated with bold different colors, which laid for the backgrounds of each section. And that it kind of even feels like going through, like an aisle of different rolls of silk, all of different colors, and you're kind of just skimming through them. And we introduced like some different page sizes, different orientation as well. So when someone's navigating the publication, they're really kind of moving things around and digging through it. Oh, yeah, that's my last slide.
Cool. I think one can really see and feel that it's also a very artistic approach, a very collaborative moment. What does it mean for you, since we talked about the Chinese, English, the bilingual moment, what does it mean to design a bilingual artist book? Did this brought some?
Oh yeah, definitely. So I grew up in Montreal, in Canada, and Montreal is actually, it's in the bilingual province of Quebec. So when I was like training to be a designer, the first years of being a designer, I was actually always designing in both French and English. So I'm like quite used to the idea of, working in two languages in tandem. But that being said, Chinese and English there's much more of a contrast between the two languages in comparison. And of course, I don't understand Chinese. So there were like a lot of like technical solves in terms of, text length being quite different, the visual imprint being quite different. So there's quite a bit more work in terms of just making sure that things balance out in a way that feels natural, and ensuring that you have like a really steady rhythm and you don't kind of prioritize one language over the other. But then beyond that, I think that just ensuring that we had like as collaborative of like a process as possible. I was always kind of bouncing infinite amounts of drafts off Xiaowen to make sure that everything made sense. So being quite close throughout the process was probably like the most important thing, I'd say.
And what Xiaowen is for you, I see that close relation between design and artistic concept. What's the importance of design that helps you to intensify your concept, or what kind of dialogue the two of you went through?
Yeah, overall, I've learned incredible amount of, things just from working with Mike. Like in the beginning, I had the idea to sort of make a book inside a book, because I somehow feel like it shouldn't be a completely linear narrative, because I've always been aware of my own mediation. Like I'm the person who's telling the story of Ken, who's telling the story of his family. And I really want this book to be very sensual. I want it to be an object. I want it to be something that people really want to hold and touch. But obviously those are like artistic concepts and kind of vague ideas, you know? So I just kind of describing all those here, an idea there, an idea there, an idea. They don't even seem coherent to myself, but somehow Mike just magically turned them into wonderful design solution. So like when I told Mike about, oh, I want to have different page lengths, page width, different colors. But then he was able to just come up with visual references. So even though there's a lot going on inside the book, none of those decisions was randomly made, you know, just because of some artistic wish. You know, for example, the colors, they were based on Chinese takeout menus. And we both looked into the history of Chinese takeout menus. Like back in the days, as we know, like Chinese migrants, they were basically only allowed to run like cheap takeout restaurants or Chinese laundry. Both were very labor intensive, and they had to run those businesses at extremely low cost in order to survive. So what a very practical design solution those Chinese restaurants came up with was to print their menus on colored sheet, which meant that instead of printing color on paper, they only needed to print black on colored sheet. It was one of the cheapest ways to produce something that doesn't look just black and white. So that's why we also based our color palettes of, you know, those like traditional, not traditional, like Chinese takeout menus. And there are many ideas like that, very nuanced. But then Mike had the challenge to balance all those ideas, because we don't want the book to look too ornamental. So in the end, I'm really happy with the balance of things. Even with, for example, I had loads of pictures I want to put in the book, but I also understand I don't want to overwhelm the readers. I don't want it to be like a coffee table book, you know, like people look at it, it just looks like a catalog with many images. So at one point, I think we developed this idea that at the beginning, the images, they're all black and white. But then as you read through the story, you get to understand the background of the family, you get to understand the complexity of the family history and the dynamics between the shop and their clients. Then you come to the colorful pictures. And it also happens to be the chapter where I talk about my filming process. So yeah, it's been really wonderful to be able to kind of exercise on those ideas, but in the end, not to be taken by the ideas, but actually find a balance and produce something that we feel happy about.
Cool. And Michael, for example, let's see the cover. There goes the very controversial notion of Oriental in relation also to Chinese history and of silk. And in which way did you tackle this aspect of nostalgia or chinoiserie, how we say?
Yeah, for sure. I actually have another reference to screen share really quickly. Yeah, so this idea of like chinoiserie was something that Xiaowen brought up very, very, very early on in the process, and it was something that into so many aspects of the narrative and the concept she was working on. Xiaowen was just talking about like Chinese takeout menus and why we're drawing inspiration from them, and that taps into this broader kind of like world of Los Angeles and of kind of like North America at a particular time in history, when you had a lot of like migration back and forth, and we were calling it like mid-century chinoiserie, which is like you know, like all these typefaces and all of these types of graphics that came out in the context of kind of like Chinese takeout restaurants and things along those lines. You had a lot of typefaces like the one that Ken's family used on the front facade of Oriental Silk importers. This typeface is actually called Wonton, and it was like designed by Westerners for Westerners to represent like, you know, Chinese characters because they intended it to make reference to like Chinese calligraphy. And even though, of course, it looks very, very different from Chinese calligraphy in itself, it has now kind of like become synonymous with the idea of, you know, small Asian businesses in the context of the Western world. And that was like one of like the main things that we decided to like hold on to and kind of like lead with in the context of the cover and that belly band, just because like it's just being authentic to what, you know, the signage on the shop looks like, making reference to that made sense. But beyond that, that decision to use that particular sign and that particular typeface is like very, very representative of a moment in time and the context in which that shop kind of thrived.
I just see there is a super interesting question in the chat. It does not relate, or it's not a question now to you, Michael, but somehow, yes, a response and a question to Xiaowen. What distinguishes the book from the documentary that you merge your own history of migration with that of Kenneth and Oriental Silk? So why did you choose? The question is that approach, and what do you try to approach to this, or maybe how consciously you took that on?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is part of what I kind of try to convey, like in this small presentation I put together. You know, why I feel like in this book I stepped forward a bit more as the narrator and being very conscious of my role of being the narrator. I think it has to do with my reflection of my own, you know, choice of living abroad. And I think particularly this book was edited during last year. And last year, I think, was just an extraordinary year for everyone to sort of reflect the idea and notion of home and the difficulty that comes with those notions. So I can't say explicitly, you know, what I'm trying to do with this book. It just feels very natural to me to write down how I would tell the same story, but with a different medium. And I recognize that once I start writing the story in Chinese, in my mother tongue, and giving also the whole perspective of how I encountered Ken, and the fact that it took me 6 months just to wait to hear from him again after I told him I would like to make a documentary film, but I didn't know if he was interested. And 6 months later, he emailed me back, said, yes, he didn't think his story would be interesting, but then he realized his parents' story were part of the family legacy, and he somehow shoulders the responsibility to pass it on. So I feel extremely privileged, you know, to be the person to document it. So I guess in the book, then I'm reflecting my own role as the creator of the project and how I understood it. I also, I guess, try to question myself why I was so drawn to his story and why, in a way, I also couldn't let it go. You know, so after I made a film, I had to write a book. So it's part of not letting go, definitely.
And actually, I would say there is one more actor we haven't talked about yet in detail or in its personality. It's the silk rolls themselves, in their texture, in their color. We've seen it in the film, the translation, the visual translation in the book, all the references, visual references Michael told us. And I mean, it's also about the colors of memory, as you write, or the tactile moment that we've been talking about. And at the same time, also silk processing, we saw it briefly, is very labor intensive and requires a lot of skills and qualities and craft. And Xiaowen, what do Chinese silks mean to you, or what do they stand for, as really that second main actor with Kenneth and in relation to you?
Yes, that's such an important question in a way. I've said this actually in another interview that silk for me is a tangible translation of nostalgia, even though nostalgia nowadays becomes sort of a problematic word. But if we are still being innocent, if we are still allowed, to be nostalgic, and I am a nostalgic person, especially when it comes to, traditional Chinese culture, and meeting a person like Ken, who's not Chinese, by nationality, but he feels some quality that he has feels very Chinese to me. So actually, we haven't mentioned yet the title of the book. So Oriental Silk, this is the name of the shop of the whole story. But actually the Chinese title, Xiangchou, it literally means silks from town or hometown. But if you read Chinese or Mandarin, the pronunciation is the same. Xiangchou is the same as nostalgia in Chinese. So there's like the double meaning in the title here. So Chinese silk represents memories of my childhood and my time spent in China. My earliest memory of silk was when I was in elementary school. We all had silkworms. All the school kids, we had silkworms. It's like a science class assignment. So for a couple of semesters, I would have a shoebox full of tiny black silkworms, and I would feed them with mulberry leaves, because that's the only type of leaf they would eat. And then after a while, they would all turn to white, puffy worms, and then eventually weave silk cocoons and die soon after becoming moths. And I remember there was lots of stories about trying to get the right type of leaves. I also remember there were street vendors selling us fake mulberry leaves, all those stories. So I think that's like a very cultural specific experience. But in China, I think this is extremely universal. So I think in a way, silk represents the good memory of my childhood in China. And it's something I would like to reflect upon, when I miss home. But then actually I want to just read briefly a quote from Dr. Wang. He is a reader in Chinese studies at the University of Westminster. He said this during a panel discussion about my work in London. It was also included in the book. He said, "To me, silk is Mr. Wang himself. It's like him being in his own Chinese universe. He's dealing with the buttons, silks, and fabrics are just like recollecting his pieces of memories. He enjoys picking them up because in this process, he's trying to record his inconsistent memories in relation to faraway China." And then it continues, it gives more historical background. The question is, what is China? How do we define China? Actually, since at least 150 years ago, a lot of Chinese people started moving abroad voluntarily or involuntarily, particularly from the hometowns of overseas Chinese in Guangdong and Fujian provinces. Kenneth Wong's family is from Toisan. 95% of the Chinese immigrants from Toisan moved to United States. It started with the gold rush in California and then the railway construction. After that, they started to run laundries or restaurants. That's the general story that also applies to Wang's family, the same trajectory. So we start to redefine China based on the connections and the interactions between mainland Chinese and overseas Chinese.
And I think this touches a question that popped up in the chat as well, that besides Chinese and English viewers who might directly relate to the story, what does you expect from people from other regions to see and to gain? And my feeling was maybe the question now was on the way to be answered is really also, yes, giving it back to you, Xiaowen, to show that this microframe really can be translated to similar experiences of movement and migration.
Yeah, I think that I hope the story of Ken's family can be an inspiration for other people who might as well consider themselves to be ordinary people to start sharing their stories. I consider myself as a super ordinary person, you know, but that's why I think I often look for inspirations from elsewhere, from other people. And that's why I have this huge interest in documentary, because I often don't feel I myself am like interested enough as a subject. But in fact, I really think there's so many people, you know, they're just living their life, you know, they're moving across places, countries, and continents by will or sometimes against their wills. And everyone has incredible stories and feelings they can really share with others. I think by sharing feelings and experiences, that makes us less alone and less isolated. So I think this is really important. You know, it's not about we discover someone with an extraordinary life, you know, but very often it's just normal people who have extraordinary feelings, because I think we all do. It's just about, you know, sharing them, then it helps us to build and strengthen our community, regardless if we can meet physically or not.
And to personally connect.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And maybe Michael, you came, for example, from Montreal, now living in London. Is that living in between something that would describe the condition of our times, or what could then, in a translated sense, migration of form or migration of ideas mean to you as a designer? Or use this as a concept, not just of people moving, but also of ideas and designs moving? Right,
totally. Yeah, I mean, I guess like I can only speak for myself really on a personal level, but I feel as if like, especially having grown up like in a city in Canada, in contrast to the cities out here in Europe, is such, or the countries out here in Europe, Canada is such like a new country, and I feel as if due to the fact that we don't have as much of like a cultural like history and legacy, there is this spirit that I grew up with of, you know, everything is multicultural, everyone is from different backgrounds, and no one's really kind of like afraid to try new things and experiment and kind of just get out there. And I think that sort of sentiment of, you know, just like cross-pollination of ideas, like migration of ideas, like be it from one country to another country or one culture to another culture, even just, you know, taking an idea in one context and, you know, maybe in its initial context, it doesn't have all that much intrigue or people don't really acknowledge it for having all that much value. If you just shift it into another context, you know, suddenly maybe it could potentially flourish just because of, you know, migrating it from one space to another. So I think that, yeah, I guess to answer your question with regards to migration in like, you know, visual languages and design, I think it's like not only like a topic, but kind of like at the end of the day, that's what all design innovation is really. It's just a borrowing of ideas, kind of taking a thought and then carrying it somewhere unexpected where, you know, you wouldn't expect it to flourish, but it does. And yeah, to me, that's kind of like the bedrock of most innovation, not only in design, it's kind of how we move forward really.
And maybe I put it another way around for you, Nicky, since in the beginning when introducing you, I forgot to say that you are also really a talented educator and a very creative networker, and spread and share Chinese fiction in events, in blogs. What do you think can we learn, nevertheless, from impulse from the Chinese contemporary fiction here? So that moment of learning from. Your sound? Your voice?
Yes, thanks. That's a very nice question, because it gives me a chance to talk about different areas of work that I do. So I'm not only translating, I am very keen to work with the author, publisher, to promote the work, but also I work on a non-profit, what we call a charity in the UK, called Paper Republic, which is devoted to, its mission is to promote Chinese literature in translation. And as you say, I also do blogs, and last but not least, I'm involved in training, or at least mentoring, other translators. What can we learn? This is an enormous body of literature, fiction, non-fiction, poetry. What do we learn from any literature? We learn to look through the eyes of the writer at the people that they are writing about. And it's an enormous, I mean, I would encourage people, if you know nothing about Chinese literature in translation and you want to learn about it, take a look at the website, paperrepublic.org, because you can pick out of that short stories and you can just get a flavor of the kind of things that you can learn from reading what Chinese language writers are writing about. It's really the same reason, for the same reason that you would read any translation, because it takes you different places and it takes you to different voices. It's all part of the world that we live in.
I wanted to reflect a bit on that, and I also see some audience questions. I just want to and also reflect on them quickly. So as someone who learned English as a second language in school, you know, it really took me at least 10 years to start like kind of properly speak it. And for the longest time, I was always very embarrassed to speak English in front of my Chinese classmates because I never felt my English was good enough. So I never dreamed of one day, you know, I will have my work translated, you know, by someone like Nicky into English. And when I read Nicky's translation the first time, I feel like really the story has a second life. And it's not the Californian life, it's also not quite the Chinese life, it's something more universal. You know, I think that's really what translation can do and help for us to truly feel like belonging to a global community. I think that's really the magic of translation.
That's a really lovely way of putting it. I like that.
Yeah. And then I saw that there's some questions from the audience members. For example, one question is about if I have shown the book to Kenneth Wong, did he have any reactions to how his family story was told? So that is so interesting because actually Ken was really a long-term collaborator now. You know, I really can't say he was the subject of my film, of the project. He is really a collaborator, and we've had like frequent communications via email mostly, and also until very recently we still write each other emails, and he has, for example, dropped off the books at various bookshops in LA and talked to people in the bookshop about the book. I'm not sure how he talked. I don't know if he told people this is me in the book, you know, or he just said, here's a book, you should look at it. But he has remained quite neutral. He never gave any, you know, creative feedback, even though I had a sense that he was positive about it. But I think he wanted to give us the creative space, and he respected that. And I just thought it's so extraordinary. He never said, oh, you shouldn't write me this way, you know, maybe you should describe me a bit younger. He never said anything like that. He just said, it's your book, it's your art, do how you feel should be right. So I think it's really wonderful. Yeah, I think that's about the questions. Oh, there's someone, Chris, reflected a bit on silkworm. Yeah, he said, when you told your story, suddenly I thought about how things that people outside China think are just Chinese can have very locally specific associations inside China. I think this is such an important, a crucial observation, right? Because if we think of China, it's like similar size to Europe, but now we're in Europe and we think of Europe. Europe has such a great diversity. There's no way we can just pinpoint, oh, people in the north or south, they're similar. There's no way, right? Even within Germany or even within Berlin, all those different districts, they fight about their characters. So yeah, so I think that's a really great observation. Okay, now I'll give it back to Inka.
that things go. Interestingly, Nicky again was talking about the voices, and as one more contribution, one more thread, I would say, that is interwoven into the making of the book, the spreading of the book, all that collaboration that goes with it, is the body language, I would say, not the voice language, but when you invited dancer and dance historian Natalie Meek to stage 4 movements, not with her voice, but with her body, that represents some key elements of the book, which are body, silk, shop, and Oriental, that we also have been talking about. And in that way, you or Natalie connect people and movement, silk in movement, migratory people somehow. And I like, it's really like a response on the one hand to Kenneth, as if it was a letter to Ken that Natalie is performing. And at the same time, it is a letter to her mom, who in the 70s, beginning of the 70s, came as a Korean to Germany, where Natalie was born then. So this experience of second generation Korean German, that's yes, it's also a shared moment for the two of us, between generations, and that connection, between you and Ken and Natalie and Ken, and then really using the body to stage this. And I found this really touching idea to show how really we have an ever extending net of relationship that we can build upon through the film and then the book and now the collaboration that you started with Natalie, that it would be really also nice sharing with the other people, that they really see what kind of collaboration come out of such projects and personal narration in it.
Yeah, maybe I just say a couple of things before we show the video, because I think Natalie is joining the audience because she
really
she felt her work is already expressed through her performance and the text she wrote to Ken. That's why she thought, I prefer not to speak at the event, but I've already, like communicated with the work. So I've known Natalie actually through an exhibition of mine in Berlin a couple years ago. And at the time, she just moved from LA to Berlin, even though she's native German. So I thought that was such an interesting connection. The project is about LA, and she just moved from LA to Berlin. And then when we start collaborating on this project, it was still, we were still like deep in the quarantine period. Basically, we couldn't really go anywhere to shoot anything. So I invited her over. We wore masks And I gave her those like silk masks that she wore during the performance. And I was sort of inspired by all those YouTube channels of home workout videos. People who usually coach in fitness studios now, they're just having their YouTube channel. And I thought we can do the same. We can do a home performance video. We don't have to go to the studio. That's how it came about. And actually this work, it comprises 4 movements. So today we're like premiering one of the movements, and through IFA Gallery's online platform, we will release 3 other movements after today's event.
I'm really afraid breaking that silence that she notes in the poem. So we are really looking forward to see the 3 other movements that Hatje is staging as a response to that film. Thank you. Are there any questions popping up in the chat? I'm looking to there. I would love to continue and actually to also cheer with you, Xiaowen, since it's really a very, and we see the detail, you can talk about it, or the reflective you are, that it's really like an ongoing process where you interweave ever new relationships that started from your personal effect to the story of Ken and your experiences of being in between, or that migration experiences in this world. So thank you, really thank you. And I think we can really see that it's such a collaborative process. As you said, it was really a very eerie year last year, but a very good year for making books, taking the time and going deeper into something, or creating a new interweaving of that. So I think this is really something that through these events could present very well, that it's a collaborative and very engaging project that you all have been involved. So thanks for joining us from London, Michael and Nicky, and all the
Thank you, Inka, for hosting this. Yes, it's really wonderful to see each other online this way, and also have people participating. I just feel so lucky, to be able to work on such a project with everyone. And I hope everyone find some kind of resonance in the story of Ken. Yeah.
And a chance maybe to have the book in the hand, because it's really about tactility and touch and a lot of value that we can start to appreciate from in you as well.
Yes, and I think we can't wait to see each other in person, like when we are allowed to touch each other, right?
And to cheer. So thank you for joining. Thank you for listening, looking. To me, it was really very vivid to see all those different layers, and it takes on further life and develops further this project by you, Xiaowen.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Looking forward to see the next movements by Natalie. So join us on Instagram and the pages we all have. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you for joining us today, everyone.
From wherever you joined us.
Yes.
Cool. So I say goodbye, we say goodbye, and cheer. Xiaowen.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye, guys. Thank you.